We've been talking about Yangming, and I mentioned that he had this teaching called the Four Axioms. And the way it happened was that he was at this place called Tianquan Bridge, and he's talking with his two leading disciples, Wang and Chen Dehong. And he gives sort of four statements. And Yangming's two leading disciples read these statements very differently. But let's go and look at what these so-called four axioms are. The first, it's a series of claims. Having no good and no evil is mind in itself. So remember, Yangming is really shifting attention from the notion of human nature to the notion of the mind working, to the working mind, the operating mind, that when freed of selfish desire, can somehow see instinctively what's good. Now, we have two translations here. The first is in larger type is I think, a more interesting one. The second you'll find in sources of Chinese tradition. And the first claim seems to be that the original state of the mind, in the original state of the mind, there's neither good nor evil. So where does good and evil come from? And there, having good and evil is the activity of the will. It's only when you start to have intentionality and focus on something that you're making choices. And in those choices, the possibility for good and evil emerges. But it's not inherent in the mind in itself. Then we go to the third axiom, and we see innate knowing is knowing the good and evil in the activity of the will. So that's sort of in brackets, that's what we call an interpolation. This is what we think Wang Yangming meant. But he has this notion of innate knowing, which sometimes I've called innately knowing the good, or the innate ability to know the good. Chinese is liangzhi. And what does it mean to know? Well, you said before, that this notion of li, which Yangming brings up in some ways, this notion of li is that it's in the mind. In fact, this is exactly what Yangming says. Mm-hmm. Li is in the mind. Li is the mind. Li is the mind working.
So there's no distinction actually between li and mind.
No. Right, and for the mind to know instinctively, to know innately, is really to know what is good and what is bad in the activity of the will, in a sense, in your own motivations, in your own purposes. That's the one thing you can know for certain. What other people mean, what's in their hearts, hard to say. But I can always know, he says, what's in my heart and what's in my will, what I intend. And that, again, if we think back to, we were talking before about Juxi, talking about the Renshin and the Daoshin, the human mind and the mind of the way in each one of us, begins to remind me of a little bit of that as well. And then the last part is the conclusion. It says, well, since you can know what's in your own will, in your own heart, and what you're intending, what does it mean to do good, to rectify actions?
So it seems, if we compare this last message with Cheng Brothers' claim, then what Cheng Brothers mean by realizing the principle of things becomes rectification of actions.
Yeah.
Here.
I think that's right. And in fact, if you look at sort of the old translation, which is trying to be close to the Chinese and consistent, it's the investigation of things, which is exactly what the Chengs mean by fully realizing the
principles of things.
Exactly. But for Yangming, it doesn't mean investigating things anymore.
And here it becomes to do good and to remove evil.
By
rectifying
your own actions.
One's actions.
Because you have already been able to see what's coming up in your own mind. And thus, performing good and getting rid of evil is what it means, in a sense, to rectify actions. So it's all really, really self-centered, it seems to me.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, in any case, the upshot of this is that Wang Ji reads this and says, aha, having no good and no evil is the mind in itself, so there is no good and evil. There's no good and evil anywhere. Right? There's just the mind working, and good and evil are totally irrelevant.
Yeah.
And the other disciple says, whoa, stop. You can't say that. If you say that, you're going to let people loose. They'll go everywhere.
Yes.
And so he says, the other disciple, Chen Dehong, says, no, it has to be gradual. It has to be gradual. You have to start with getting rid of evil, performing the good, And gradually you can get to the point where you realize that the mind in itself has neither good nor evil. And then Yangming looks at them, and you know what he says? Because they say, Master, who's right? Who's right? You know what he says? Would you like to guess?
I think he acknowledged both.
Exactly. That's what he does. He says, hey, you're both right. Work it out. Thus leaving us with that conundrum.
Yes.
But it does make me think that Yangming is really still very much part of the